If our politicians were to consult their Constitution before every vote, we estimate that 80% of the government would not exist. If that were the case, we would also have a government that prioritizes protecting liberties, not controlling its citizens. Today, we're discussing how it's possible to decimate the size of government and ensure that its main priority is our liberties. I'm Paul Dragoo, and this is Freedom is the Cure. As I speak, the national debt is nearing $29 trillion. That debt pays for federal programs that have no business existing. But our elected officials have used their powers to not only plunder the fruits of our labor, but to control us. In today's largest American cities, citizens can't go to a ball game or eat at a restaurant without showing their vaccine papers. Requiring passports to move about in your own country is a hallmark of an authoritarian state. The Soviets did it, as did the socialist Third Reich. The good news is that COVID-related mandates and restrictions have awakened millions of Americans to the fact that government, when allowed, will and does oppress. But we didn't get here overnight. For a century, like a metastasizing cancer, government continued to grow larger, less efficient, and more coercive. Elected officials have been lobbying out new laws, regulations, and departments like Santa throwing candy at a Christmas parade. My guests today are Congressman Gomez and Peter Rykowski from the research department here at the John Birch Society. And we're going to be discussing the proper size and role of government and how Americans can put it back in its place. Hey guys, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Paul.
Thanks for having us.
So that 80%, that would seem like a really large number for a lot of people to say that 80% of the government is unconstitutional. What are some examples of institutions and programs that have no constitutional permission to exist?
I mean, there's so many unconstitutional ones. I mean, the education department, there's no, the Constitution doesn't give the states, or doesn't give the federal government any authorization to have any role in education policy. The transportation department, there's no constitutional authorization for that for the federal government. Health and Human Services, the EPA, so many other agencies. With all those, there's nothing delegated to the federal government, and all that is reserved to the states and to the people.
Yeah, the most recent example would be the Department of Homeland Security, authorized shortly after 9/11, created, but there's no authorization in the Constitution for a Homeland Security Department. If you want these things to be constitutional, then you'd have to amend the Constitution to allow for these departments, like just like the Constitution already allows for the Department of the Secretary of State. That Department of State, that is constitutional. But a lot of these newer ones, the last 100+ years, they've got no authorization.
Well, how do they justify, is it always the well-being clause? Like, how do they justify such programs that I think anyone could read through the Constitution and see that, there is nothing in there permitting, like you mentioned, the Department of Education, Homeland Security?
I mean, they barely even try to justify it these days. I mean, they might cite the necessary and proper clause, which they completely misinterpret and take out of context. But more and more, I mean, our government officials don't even care about what the Constitution says, and the fact that it only delegates certain enumerated powers to the federal government and leaves the rest of it to the states.
Yeah, during the debate for Obamacare, there was one Democratic congressman, whose name escapes me at the moment, but he said that the federal government can do essentially whatever it wants. And when Ron Paul, shortly after the whole 9/11 attacks, and when George W. Bush made the case for going into Iraq, you had Ron Paul, who wanted to have a declaration of war. He opposed the wars in Afghanistan and the wars in Iraq specifically, but he said if we're going to do this, we should do it the right way. We should have a declaration of war. And he proposed that in the Congressional committee at the time, which was chaired by a Republican, since they were the majority. Both the Republican and Democratic chairpersons shot him down for suggesting that they called his ideas dangerous and frivolous. And that's the mindset that these members of Congress have in leadership of both parties. That, well, they're not going to try to justify, because to try to justify everything with the Constitution is just that, dangerous and frivolous.
That's ludicrous. My understanding is that we haven't actually declared war since we did it in World War II. We've obviously been involved in a mountain of conflicts, and there have been very few victories, outright victories in that. I would think maybe there's a lesson to learn there. What about the Health and Human Services Agency? Is the federal health, what is it, the Department of Health and Human Services, is that unconstitutional?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing in the Constitution that allows the federal government to have any role or or do anything with regards to health policies.
What role can you think of how its existence has aided this authoritarianism that we are now seeing from the federal government under the guise of public health with this whole COVID hysteria?
Well, there are a few things. First off, I mean, one of many examples, Dr. Anthony Fauci is an employee of the Health and Human Services Department, but there are a lot of other, much more substantial examples as well. The CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, that's another sub-agency of HHS, and they're the ones telling people, you got to wear masks. If you get on a plane or a bus or a train, you got to put on a face mask, even though it, has doesn't do anything. And then we have the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, which essentially banned any visitors from entering nursing homes. So if you have a parent or a grandparent, about to die, you can't actually enter in to see that parent or grandparent. And then they most recently mandated that all nursing home employees get the vaccine.
And this was a CMS guideline?
Yep. Those were orders that they made, and they affected most, if not all, nursing homes all across the country.
In our communities, we would see this centralized approach to COVID. And I think that's a good argument for why we don't need a federal HHS, because the communities were so different. And now as information is coming in, we're realizing that there's nothing to suggest that those who took the guidelines, who used the CDC guidelines, fared any better. Obviously, there's a lot of comparisons between California and Florida. Florida's like, we're going to do our own thing. And it seems that they fared better. I don't want there to be any confusion. Maybe some folks are listening and thinking, wow, it's like these guys are anti-government. Because a lot of these institutions, this would be allowed by the states. And the states do have their own health departments and whatnot, right?
Usually the state governments mirror what the federal government does. So if there's a Department of Homeland Security at the federal level, which there is, and then a lot of states have their own state versions of that. But the 10th Amendment specifically states that the power is not delegated in the Constitution to the federal government, or thereby reserved to the people or to the states. Mm-hmm. I'm paraphrasing it.
Yeah.
But essentially, like the Department of Education that Peter mentioned before, there's no federal authorization for that, but that does not prohibit the state governments from creating a state Department of Education. Now, education would be better handled if federal and state government got out of it. But when you look at the U.S. federal Constitution, there's no prohibition on the state governments from being allowed to be in charge of that. Of course, the best way to handle education would be at the most local level, so local municipalities, like city governments. But even then, a better approach than that, of course, would be homeschooling or allowing churches and religious institutions to be in charge of education, or the parents, which is what the Bible says. The Bible recommends that parents raise their children, not give them up to, that's one of their biblical responsibilities as parents.
I think it's so hard for people to fathom, to imagine a life without, dumping your kids off, on the curb, essentially. And we've gone generations now. This is something that's personal to me because we started homeschooling our child just last year, and we learned a lot about the harms of public education. Of course, we here at the John Birch Society, we have a Save Our Children from Public Education action project, and over time, there's been quite a bit. And I think people should know that not only are these unconstitutional, but some of them, probably most of them, but especially the Department of Education, it's terribly inept. If you go to the nation's report card, which is where the government keeps track of how good it's doing, there's not one single category in which even half of the students are proficient. Have you guys seen that? I think it's 42% is the highest a senior is proficient at, and it's economics, which I think is pretty ironic. But if you go, again, to the nation's report card, you can put this in a search bar, you'll see that the lowest category, the lowest percentage rate that any high schooler, a 12th grader, is proficient in is history, American history. And I think that's really telling. That's really telling, because I think that's where you would learn about the Constitution and what's not constitutional and what is. Before we go into how we can write this, this is something we've talked about as well. There's a lot of talk about the deficit and what would actually happen if we curbed down, we decimated government to its constitutional parameters. What would happen to the deficit?
Well, the deficit would totally disappear because we wouldn't be spending these massive sums of money. I mean, how much did we spend last year? I think it was like over $6 trillion. How much of that was constitutional? I don't think, almost zero of it. I mean, so much of it was unconstitutional. So if we cut all of that, the debt and the deficit wouldn't even be problems anymore.
Just think of it in terms of like personal debt. Suppose you have lots of credit card bills. You're in lots of credit card debt or student loan debt that's in the thousands or tens of thousands, or if it's college, hundred thousands of dollars maybe, especially if you had a higher degree. And but part of the problem isn't just the debt you're in, but you're constantly buying something new you don't need. Maybe you got second house, you're leasing cars that you're not even driving just because they're cool. So you're constantly just spending money. If you cut all the spending to just what you needed, maybe you can't afford to live in that fancy house and pay that mortgage, move into a small apartment, and cut down your grocery bill to just what you need and not the extravagant, expensive products, and stop buying all this frivolous stuff you don't need. And you only focus on what you needed to survive on. All that extra money that you were just wasting away on junk, you could now use it to pay your personal debt, your credit card bills, your student loan bills. So likewise, apply that to Congress. If they just stop spending on all this 80+% of unconstitutional
if we just start living within our means.
Yeah, then they can start paying off those debts that they owe to whoever we're borrowing money from. Sadly, China, the Federal Reserve, because all the money that's printed has to be paid back on interest. But we would be able to begin to have more fiscal sanity, and the deficit, it overnight, I mean, it wouldn't go away overnight, it's so large, but it would start to really go away within a few years. We would be totally debt-free.
How would we even get there? How do we get here, and how would we get back to reducing the size of government?
Well, we got to where we are because Congress has totally ignored the Constitution in so many various ways, whether it's creating these various unconstitutional agencies or delegating power to the president unconstitutionally. So they failed to follow the Constitution, and the American people failed to hold the congressmen accountable by voting them out at the next election.
Yeah, I would say that's the key right there. It's the electorate really is the bigger problem than even Congress. When Alex de Tocqueville wrote his book, Democracy in America, back in the mid-19th century, he discussed how, especially in Connecticut, I believe it was the case example, how you couldn't find a person, I believe it was in Connecticut, but nevertheless, you couldn't find a person, a U.S. citizen at the time, who did not know his or her the Constitution of the United States very well. And now, go to Connecticut and try to find the average voter who knows the Constitution very well or even very little. You'll be hard pressed to find. You'll find people who don't know squat about the Constitution, probably in the majority of the population, and that's not just true of Connecticut or New England, but the entire United States of America. So we've had education in our country in the 19th century, especially early 19th century. Americans knew the Constitution. They studied it. There were so many law books written on, just commentaries on the Constitution. And then by the time you get to the late 19th century, you see the rise of the populist movement and the progressive movement, and Americans just ignoring the Constitution and voting for what they want. I have this need. Government should be the solution, with William Jennings Bryan and the populist movement and progressivism taking a hold in the early 20th century. So the American people started to ignore the Constitution, not know it as well, and that was reflected in who they voted into office. So here we are after decades or over a century of progressivism and populist left-leaning government, and this is where it's taken us. So how do we get back? It's going to be a gradual road, but it's going to be a gradual road of educating the American electorate about the Constitution. So we get back by educating voters this on what is the Constitution, and for that the JBS offers the
Constitution is a Solution.
The Constitution is a Solution series with Robert Brown teaching on it. That's a foundational. We need to know the Constitution first, and once we start to get that down packed, then we start educating the electorate on, hey, your congressman voted on this that is not constitutional. That's not good. Or she voted on this thing that is constitutional. Let's reward her accordingly. That kind of thing. So that's where we need to go. We need to educate the electorate on the constitutionality of the votes, but not just the constitutionality of the votes, the cost of the votes. I think that speaks louder than anything else. If you could show people these expenses, because we talk about like coronavirus and these medical things that Peter was discussing earlier with HHS and CDC. Why does the government get away with some of that stuff in part? Well, it's because the American people think they have a need, and the government's got to pay for it right away. But if the American people saw the cost, like most Americans who choose to get vaccinated because they think it's the right thing or they've been brainwashed, whatever, it's their choice if they want to do that. But if they're making that choice to get that vaccine, part of the reason why they're doing it is because there's no out-of-pocket cost. They believe it's free. And in a way it kind of is, because they're not directly paying for the vaccine shots, but the government is paying for it. So they are going to pay in the long run. So what's the cost of these coronavirus bills? That's when you start to show the American people it costs this many trillions of dollars and what that equals to you. I think then the American people start to wake up, wait a minute, I'm going to have to pay that back eventually later. It's like a credit card. We don't pay for it now, but the bill will come. And I know Peter has a lot more to say about that.
Well, what about the inflation we are experiencing now? Is there any connection between that and our entitled attitude and our, paternal government?
Well, when you're printing money like crazy, I mean, all that does is it...
Well, we're printing it to take care, right? To dole out, it's seemingly, as citizens, they look at it and they're like, I'm getting what I need. I'm getting a check and I'm not doing anything for it. So that seems pretty...
Yeah, that and funding all the various government agencies.
Yeah. I wanted to mention, you brought up the Constitution as the Solution. It's a wonderful, wonderful series. It's actually how I came into the JBS fold. I don't know if a lot of people have that same experience, because it's a 6-part series. It is 6 lectures. It takes, I think it's at least an hour each. But it really opened up my eyes, and that's why we work so hard. That's why we work so hard to emphasize teaching the Constitution. So we got new tools. We got new tools all the time, but I guess it's actually not a new tool. It's a new addition of tools we had. You guys have here on the table, you have what's called Congressman Scorecard, right? And these help. These are accessible, and the point of this is to help people determine who is actually following the Constitution. We talked about Congress. In a way, we elect these people, but then they make the votes that ends up putting us in these situations. You guys want to talk about the Congressman Scorecard and the Freedom Index?
Yeah, so the New American publishes the Freedom Index 2 times a year, 4 times per Congress. And It's a great way to educate Americans about what the Constitution actually says on important issues and to hold congressmen accountable, showing them showing the American people how faithful they are to the Constitution. So now we're rolling out the Congressman Scorecard, which is really a convenient way to do the same things, educate Americans and hold Congress accountable, but doing it in a way where people can spread the word, print out various pamphlets showing people how their congressman is doing. And it's very convenient, just a piece of regular, ordinary computer paper. You print it out, and it shows 6 very important votes from the current Congress, how the congressman voted, whether the vote was constitutional or not, and in many cases, how much the bill costs a typical American household. So it's a very effective way of educating people and making sure that Congress is faithful to the Constitution.
Well, I'm holding 2 Congressman Scorecards here, and I got one for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Rand Paul, and they have significantly different scores. Christian, how do we get here?
Well, I just want to go back to you were mentioning that these are almost like new editions. So for those that are listening, and maybe even, of course, those that are watching as well, that may some of the old-time Birchers will recall TRIM, the tax reform immediately campaign that JBS had from the late 70s through the early 2000s, where we produced essentially a scorecard on how members of only the House of Representatives were voting. Now we have a very similar tool called Scorecard, not just for the House, but also for the Senate. And it does more or less the same work of educating the electorate about a member of Congress. So in the case of Rand Paul, who's a U.S. Senator and AOC, who represents a congressional district that covers part of the Bronx and Queens and New York City, the scores are vastly different. One, they're in 2 different legislative branches, so there's different votes. But Rand Paul in the U.S. Senate is a person who consistently votes with the U.S. Constitution more times than not, usually almost always. And AOC is one who rarely votes the constitutional way. And when she does vote the constitutional way, it may be motivated for an unconstitutional reason. But with the scorecard, what's nice about it is, like Peter was saying, you could print it out on either thenewamerican.com or thefreedomindex.org. You can print them out in color as a bifold, double-sided, or at the save cost, you can print it in black and white. And a good way to make this tool effective is to print it on colored paper. And for those that are listening and can't see what we have in front of us, we have some sample copies that are actually printed in various colors. You can go to Office Max, Staples, or Amazon and buy your different colored papers. But we have those with low scores on pink paper, the pinkos on bright pink neon paper, and those who vote, let's say, really well, like, over 90
give
or 100.
Give them the green light?
Yeah, you give them the green score, like in school, and the teacher had the red pen for bad and the green pen for good. Of course, you could use red paper if you want. It's a little harder to see with red paper. With pink, the connotation being they're a pinko, because they're not quite a full communist, although that could be debated with some of the members of Congress. But you have, let's say, a town hall meeting, and AOC, let's say she's your congresswoman. You live in the Bronx, Paul, and your congresswoman is AOC, and she's going to have a town hall meeting. So you decide to go there to the South Bronx, where she's going to have her meeting, and you print these out on your computer, black and white, and you show them, hand them out on pink paper, so it's bright, everyone can see it, and everyone looks at how she voted on various issues. And it must be noted that this isn't for partisan reasons. We produce this to educate, so we don't give scores based on party. There certainly are Republicans with very low scores, and most Democrats get poor scores because almost all the Democrats don't vote constitutionally to begin with. That's their own problem. But this is not a partisan gimmick. This is about showing how your elected official in the House and U.S. Senate is voting in accordance to the Constitution. And the beautiful thing about the scorecard on the back, not just does it have a check or an X on how they voted, if it's good or bad, but we also have the cost per household.
I
Peter,
see here.
I'll let Peter discuss more about the importance of that and how that is determined.
So that's not their salary.
No, that's how much the bill costs per household. Because it's easy for people when looking at bills just to view it in an abstract way. But if you put the cost per household, now you're telling people or showing people how much the bill will actually cost them personally.
Right.
So we see here, AOC and some of the other congressmen, they supported the COVID appropriations bill that was passed in March of this year. That bill costs over $14,000 per household. So you and your family, if you want to, just pay off this single bill, you'd have to pay $14 of your own, $14,000.
Big difference.
Yeah, big difference. But $14,000 of your own money.
Right.
And then further down, the so-called bipartisan infrastructure bill, which very little of it actually was infrastructure. Congress passed that. That costs over $9,000 per taxpayer, per household. And then the Build Back Better Act, which the House passed but the Senate has not voted on yet, costs over $13,000 per household. So add that all up, and people are paying like $30,000 or more for just the various bills that we listed, and we could put a lot more bills on this scorecard.
There were probably some Americans during the whole COVID fiasco pandemic that were maybe happy to get that $1,000 stimulus or more in the mail, especially if they had kids. Maybe they got a couple $500 here and there for the kiddos that they got too. But when you look at what that cost you, unless you had a lot of kids. It's costing you more to get that money from the government. It's almost like I have a $5 bill, or better yet, I have a nickel and you have a dime, and I try to trade you. Hey, look at this big dime. It's bigger than that dime. Look at this big nickel I have. It's bigger than your dime. I try to trade it in for you. I mean, I'm getting the better deal. That's what the federal government is doing. They're giving up these stimulus checks with COVID, let's say.
Yeah.
But then you have to pay back how much more in the cost per household. So it's not really a good deal if you look at it just mathematically.
Yeah. So these bills, they completely nullify what you get from the COVID paychecks, but then also the bills have a terrible effect on inflation. So even what you're getting from the government, gets decreases in its value.
It's totally canceled out.
It's the hidden tax. Every time the government just spends this money or prints new money like crazy, whatever you have saved in your bank savings or even under your bed, it's like it's being taxed secretly. The value is being depreciated from that and being taken away. That's basically, we're taking from Paul to pay Peter.
Yeah.
Like the value of what you already had so we can give more to other people.
Well, so these bills definitely contribute to inflation, which is essentially robbing you. Inflation is a way to devalue your currency, your money, therefore taking away, stealing in a sense, because if we didn't have inflation, your money wouldn't be devalued. And that's what a lot of all these bills, all this government intrusion, all they're coming to save the day, that's really what it amounts to. I don't know where it ends, really. I looked at an article that we printed in 1986, I believe, and Peter, you looked at the same one, and I don't know if you got a chance to read it, but I mean, the writer was talking about Reagan's spending, and the deficit then was $2 trillion, and he's saying, we keep going this way, we are in big, big trouble. We're approaching $29 trillion. Like, this has to, I mean, I don't know. Is there any hope really at $29 trillion, or are we just gonna spend till we fall apart? What a weird question.
As time
right?
goes on, it certainly will get harder and harder to make those deep cuts.
Right. Jeez.
That's why it's so important for us to be educating people right now, and not sitting back, but getting active right now and educating people about these bills and how they align or completely violate the Constitution, doing it right now and not getting complacent.
You guys, I really appreciate these tools. I don't know if there's anyone beyond you guys working to make these tools. If so, thank them for me. I mean, these are amazing tools, and we make, as you guys said, we make these available. You can download them. They're free. They're accessible, right? You can go online. Where can people find the Congressman Scorecard?
If you go to thefreedomindex.org or thenewamerican.com, you can find the Freedom Index. And once you access the page, you'll be able to quickly find the scorecards from there.
Yeah.
And we also include tutorial videos and a user guide to further help people understand not just how to find them, but also how to effectively use them.
Yeah, so once you get to the homepage for the Freedom Index on either of those URLs that Peter mentioned, the scorecard function will be on the left side of the screen. It says scorecard under Freedom Index, so click on that so you can get to generate the scorecards. And once you click on scorecard, you're taken to a page that shows, is it the first one, like all the U.S. senators, I believe?
Yep, first one, yep.
Yeah, so there's a tab there to switch it over to House. And you could search by the name, or you can go through the list. And when you click on whoever's name you generate on the screen, let's say it's our favorite Congresswoman, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, you can scroll down. You see an online version of her scorecard, electronic version. You can scroll below, and you can put in your contact information. If you want to pass these out, you want to have people maybe get back to you if they have any questions or whatnot. You could put down your name and phone number, email, contact info if you want on the bottom of the in a little text box there, and it'll be generated in the PDF. And like I said before, you could print it as a bifold, you could print it as portrait style, and it'll have all the same information.
What about, you mentioned the Freedom Index? I don't think we touched on that. Can you quickly go over that? It's kind of the same concept, right?
Well, we do the Freedom Index 4 times per Congress, so. The scorecards are really a subset of the Freedom Index votes, and it's really the scorecards are based on the Freedom Index. But that's really our main tool for educating people about how faithful our congressmen, our U.S. representatives and senators are to the Constitution, and then showing people the bills that they vote on, are they constitutional, are they not? What does the Constitution say on that?
Yeah, so the Freedom Index primarily focuses on the constitutionality of the votes, and it's not individual. It's every congressman's on in the print version at least. We have every state, every representative, every U.S. senator. The scorecards are individual. They're tailored for your congressional district or for your state in case of the U.S. Senate. And we emphasize cost per household in the scorecard. The Freedom Index doesn't really emphasize that aspect.
Awesome tools, guys, really awesome. And so we encourage everyone listening and watching to go to thenewamerican.com. You can get these tools, and this is pretty much the best way to rein in that massive, overgrown, unconstitutional aspect of the government that we've been talking about. There is no other way. We have to know what is constitutional and what is not, and then we have to hold these people up to that criteria. I think there's probably some of them who don't even know. They don't think like that. And so I would think the best thing is we figure out who they are, and the electorate then either gets rid of them or educates them and reforms them or whatever, So thank you, gentlemen. Thank you so much for what you do, and thanks for this wonderful work.
Thanks for having us on, Paul.
Thank you.
So there you have it, folks. Remember, you can find the Freedom Index at thefreedomindex.org and thenewamerican.com. Thank you for tuning in, and Merry Christmas.